You guys, summer is over here. Here on our High Desert Homestead, we are getting below 40 degrees. We are dipping into 30 degrees for the first time this week, which means we need to get ready or else we're gonna lose most of our produce that is still in our garden right now. I really hope someday to be harvesting and growing things with a much longer harvesting season, but we don't have the infrastructure, the tunnels, the covers quite yet, but that is in the works. But for now, all we can do is pick everything that's gonna get damaged by the frost. If we don't pick it now, we will lose all our tomatoes, we'll lose all our cucumbers, we'll lose all of our peppers, and maybe even our beans. We went out as a family and picked all of these things just in case, which means that our whole countertop was just covered in produce, and that means that we had a big job ahead in preserving all this produce. So join me as we gather and harvest, prepare for the fall, and can like crazy. All of these little ones.
Even that little red one?
Yeah, the red ones, the green ones. So our first project was to pick every single jalapeno that we had. I didn't realize how many jalapeno pepper plants that I had planted. So it was actually really fun to harvest so many, and I think I'll do it again next year because I loved having a good harvest of jalapenos. I was a little disappointed in thinking that we were going to have to pick all of our produce this week, but then I realized, well, my ultimate goal for this fall is to build soil health. So harvesting all of the things from each garden row made that possible for us to be able to prep these rows for planting cover crop and getting the soil health built up better. So we went out on this super windy day and harvested these peppers. We didn't really have a lot of time to waste, so picking on a windy day was going to happen. In fact, our family has really just adjusted to the windy afternoons that we will occasionally get. As you can see on these pepper plants, they were kind of dead because we did get a little teeny frost last week at like 42 degrees, and so the leaves are dead, but the peppers are actually perfectly fine, and that's how some of our bell peppers are too. You got more, Junie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mom,
Thanks, Hazel.
bite one of these. No, they're spicy.
You do it. I know you want to try. Some of them are probably more spicy than others.
The green ones are probably...
The seeds are the spiciest part, so if you nibbled the end, just the tip, then you wouldn't get the spiciest part. Wait, no, that's the stem. The tip, like the pointy part, like the tip.
Yeah, that's not spicy.
Is it not? You just tasted one? So jalapenos, some are more spicy than others.
The tip tastes like a pepper.
It does?
I know. I want to eat it all now.
You guys are brave. Knowing that I had a huge jalapeno harvest coming up, I had been brainstorming what we could do with these jalapenos before we went out and picked them. In fact, I decided last weekend just some general ideas of what we could do. So I didn't really want to freeze these. I didn't want to preserve them that way. And I wanted to can them, but I wanted to can them more in a way of something that's usable instead of just a plain jalapeno pepper. And then I had the idea to also dehydrate them. So I had about 6.5 pounds of jalapenos. I needed to weigh them because one of the canning recipes that I want to do was for cowboy candy. And the other way I wanted to do was to dehydrate. So I took the other remaining peppers that I didn't need. We needed 4 pounds for the cowboy candy, and then we had the other 2 to 3 pounds that you dehydrated and wanted to make a jalapeno powder that I could put into soups and stews if I wanted to add a little kick, and especially if I wanted to add a little kick to just my own soup and not the family soup, it would just make it easier to do it that way. So I got those in the dehydrator, and then I began to get the rest of the jalapenos ready. So in the recipe it said to cut them in half and shake off the excess seeds. but I didn't really want a ton of seeds in mine really at all. So I got most of my seeds out for the cowboy candy. And I know it gets sweetened. In fact, it gets sweetened a lot. But I still just wanted to not risk having it to be too spicy. And it took me like 2 hours to do this. So it was a process.
She out?
So the recipe I'm following is from this book, Candied Jalapenos. And in here, she talks about how you can dice them instead of just slice them to make it more of a relish. And that was something I wanted to do because I wanted not sliced jalapenos. I wanted to be able to put it on things like burgers or hot dogs, or you can spread it over things like cream cheese and make a dipping sauce. I just felt like a diced version of this would be more usable for us. So we added the sugar, the seasonings, the apple cider vinegar. There were mustard seeds, cayenne pepper, which I was a little nervous about adding because it's already going to be spicy, but we did it and I mixed that up. So you mix up this brine, I guess you could say, and let that all of that dissolve. I generally get the pressure canner warming the jars while I'm prepping the food, and this depends on what I'm prepping. If the prep is a long time, then I might wait a little bit. So I got the jalapenos stirring in there, and while I was waiting for those to cook down, the dehydrated jalapenos were ready. So I decided to work on those while the other stuff was cooking. I originally was trying to shove all these sliced, dehydrated pepper pieces into the jar and it was not working. So I used my brain and decided to put it on just a foldable mat and then slide them in. And that worked a lot better. And I actually had more of these than I thought I was going to. So I had to do it in a couple rounds and just blended it up into this powder. And oh my goodness, if you ever try this at home, be very careful when you're taking the lid off because after I had blended it, I unscrewed the lid and opened it, and this like powdered jalapeno powder dusting shot out, and it about like made me die. It got up into my nose, and I just inhaled that dust, and it was so spicy. It was really intense, so be careful when you're doing that. So, once moving back over to our candied jalapenos, you're supposed to scoop with like a slotted spoon, the jalapenos into the jar and then boil the sauce for a few more minutes, and then you can add that to the jar and then can it. So that's what I did. This recipe said it was going to make 8 pints if you did 4 pounds of jalapenos, but I only got 4 pints. So I don't know quite what I did wrong there. Maybe it's because I removed most of the seeds and so that brought it down a little bit. Not quite sure. And I'm finding that most of the time when I'm canning something, it seems like the measurements are a little off as far as like how much you get at the end. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. So you kind of just gotta go with it. So before I ever started canning, I was so intimidated by the process. And now that I've been doing it, it's really not that difficult. It's just like following a recipe. Now I've learned and I am intimidated by the dishes that are made from canning. Every time I get the canner out and I start getting things ready to preserve, the kitchen just explodes. So there is that to be had. All right, so me and the kids all went out to pick all our tomatoes, peppers, beans, and cucumbers, all the peppers. So we have some that look really great, like this one, but we also have some that have like rotted spots. And I didn't want to just waste all of those, so we'll do something with those later. And here are all of our beans. So these are a dried bean that you can cook, and so we're slowly peeling those into the bowl. Some of them are still green, so we'll probably wait until those turn more more brown and crispy to get them. So we're just slowly peeling those. And here, tomatoes, we have so many green tomatoes. And so I decided to put them in this box to let them ripen up over time. And just as each one or two starts to ripen, we can just pick from them as we go. And if they start to go bad, I'll end up just canning them and preserving them in a green tomato recipe. So now I'm separating the peppers. I have three main goals for our pepper harvest. So one is I want to can peppers just like a plain pepper because I have some soups and stew recipes that call for a whole green pepper. And so I want to can them in half pints so that half pint I feel like cans about a whole pepper so that I can just pull one of those out, slice it up, and throw it into the soup and stew. And the peppers that I'm using for that are the ones that have some yucky spots that I'll just cut around. For the other peppers that I separated into ones that are larger pieces, and I'm going to make stuffed peppers with those. And I'm making a double batch so I can freeze one of those. And the last category is just peppers that are crisp still, that can just be eaten fresh, but are kind of a weird shape that would be bad for making stuffed bell peppers. So we'll just put those in the fridge and just munch on them throughout the week. Everybody in my house loves having just a nice fresh sliced bell pepper at lunch or for a snack. So I went ahead and started slicing these bell peppers. I cut off any chunks that were kind of rotten and just threw them in my compost. You can see me on the left side of me, I have a pull-out garbage drawer, and in the front is just our trash. And then in the back, we have actually a bucket for our compost. And once that fills up, we take it out back and put it into our compost pile. So it's super handy having that bucket really close. I can just swipe things off the counter straight into my compost bin, which makes it super easy to get into the composting habit, which I am so happy to be able to be doing again. So, canning peppers just plain is pretty simple. You just boil them for I think it's about 4 minutes, add a little salt, a little vinegar, depending on which size of jar you use, and then you can can those. So this recipe was right on. So it told you how many this book didn't told you how many peppers you could fit in a jar approximately. And so I got 10 half pints out of these peppers, the ones that I cut off the yucky parts. So it's going to be great to have 10 servings of peppers that I can add to taco soups or other things that we like to add peppers into. And so during this process, I found my canning tongs. I brought them out and noticed that there were parts missing to the hinges that held it all together. My kids think the canning tongs are just the funnest toy ever. So they got broken, and switch meant that I had to kind of fidget with them every time I needed to lift the jar up, and my phobia of dropping one using those tongs increased so much more after that. And then when they were finished, I tried using my hands, but it was just too hot. So I still had to just shove the pins in and just pray that they didn't fall out while I was getting the cans out. I was going out to run some errands today, and so I picked up another one for the last thing that we're going to preserve today. Okay, so now on to our stuffed bell peppers. The first time I've ever made these was actually this year. I'd seen them in recipes, and for some reason I've just never tried them. But I tried them about a month ago, and it pleased about 70% of the family. So that's a pretty good percentage when feeding young children. And so I thought we could do a meal for tonight with stuffed bell peppers and then freeze a meal for another time. So I doubled the recipe for the filling. I got onions from our garden. I got some basil from the garden. I got some parsley. Our parsley really started taking off. I got some thyme and got all those herbs from our little herb garden. I began just by sauteing the onions we grew in just some oil, adding seasonings, and over time you add the sauces, the tomatoes, the meat, and just mix it all up and cook it down until you have this thicker sauce that you can add into the stuffed bell peppers. While you're making that sauce, you also steam the peppers. So the way that you do that is you actually just add water into the bottom of your pan and steam the peppers for about 20 minutes. So when those were about done was also when our filling was about done. Add in some rice to the filling, and that just thickens it up and makes it a little bit more filling. So as I was making this, my pan was getting so full, and I was like, I doubled this recipe, and it called for making it with 6 peppers, and I filled 12 peppers with doubling the recipe, and there was still enough to make probably another pan of peppers. So I ended up just letting that cool down and just putting it in a bag, and I will have the filling for stuffed peppers that we can just add to steamed peppers in the future. So just like the weather predicted, we had a foggy, frosty morning. And this wasn't a super heavy frost, but it was enough that it would do some damage. And so we were so glad that we harvested all of that produce. We got working on shelling all of these beans, and I decided to, while I was in the harvesting and preserving mode, pick this entire row of beets. So I have 2 rows of beets. Well, this one's probably more like 30 feet of a row of beets. I had planted my tomato plants, and then at the base some beets, because I was going to have my tomato plants be trellised, and so they would go up and there'd be space underneath them to grow a root vegetable. And I usually like to grow something underneath my tomato plants to not waste that space. Anyway, we lost a lot of our tomatoes due to improper watering this summer. You've heard me talk about it time and time again. We really struggled with watering systems, and then we went out of town, and the second I got the watering system back up, the tomato plants that we did have left were thriving. So the beets did great. So I went ahead and just decided, well, since the tomato plants at the end of the row are done, I should harvest these beets, and then I could get this row ready to plant cover crop in. So, as people have been asking, when are we going to get chickens? When are the other animals and other projects happening on our little homestead? And that will all come once I get the garden put to bed for the winter. And that's just like how I like to call it. Um, and winter isn't for a while, and normally I would be going nuts with planting all the fall crops, root vegetables, getting things kale, lettuces, spinaches. I would be having those growing on all of our rows in this fall season because those can tolerate a good amount of frost. But like I said, my main goal has been to build the soil. So instead of planting root vegetables, as soon as something is done and a veggie is done and we can harvest from it, I actually just pull it and start planting cover crop so that we can boost that soil. In the future, we'll plant fall crops. So this year's goal is to put the garden to bed, plant all the garlic, plant all the cover crop, and then all that we'll have to do for the garden for the rest of the year is just weed and occasionally water. Once that's done, and once we get, if you notice, all of the trenches and ditches for more irrigation systems done in our backyard, we will be ready to go on building our chicken coop and getting the orchard all ready. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now that the temperatures are cooling down, we are going to put this lower board back onto our rabbit hutch. We had removed it because it created a really good airflow for the rabbits over the summer. We usually get a little bit of a cool wind in the summer afternoons, and so that helped them tremendously this summer. So now that we're dipping into cooler temperatures, the rabbits probably would appreciate a warmer hutch over a cooler hutch. There's this thing when you think about beets. Growing up, I didn't really know what a beet was, and I remember the very first time that my grandma had opened a jar of her own canned beets, dumped them into a white ceramic bowl on the table, and I stared at those and was like, those look disgusting. They are slimy and red, kind of like they looked like cranberry sauce, and I just thought they looked gross. But naturally being a very curious child, I decided to give them a try and just see what they actually were. I don't think my grandma even told me what they were until after I had tasted them. And then that first bite I took of them and I loved it. So I really wanted to do that and can my own beets. And since it's another preservation day, I have a hard time liking cooking dinner after, so I went ahead and cooked up some taco soup ahead of this so it would be ready for dinner. And I did sprinkle some of that jalapeno powder in it, and it was really, really good. So since I had that love for canned beets, I knew I was going to want to do that on our homestead someday. And in the years past, I've tried growing beets and they've never bulbed up like these. And I don't know what I did wrong, but this has been a really good year. We've had a ton of really good beets. And when canning these, there are very few things that I will bust out an apron for, and beets are one of those things. This apron was one that my kids were given to color on for me, and that's what I have. And oh, and my Santa apron that my grandma made for me. So I got it out for this because man, when you cut these things, it looks like there was a massacre that occurred on your kitchen counter, and I was just so worried that I was going to get it everywhere, but it ended up being just fine. And because these were slightly cooked, I boiled them whole with the stems and the roots. That's what the recipe said to do. They were already cooked a little bit, and they actually tasted really good. So I was slicing, snacking, and just making a huge mess. But it was worth it. These were so good. And we have one other row of beets, so I can't wait to can. So I sliced them in just discs. The recipe said doing cubes, but my grandma made them in discs, and so that's what I remember them as, little chips, I guess you could say. And then you just pour hot water over them and then pressure can them, and that is it. Never have I canned so many different things in a few days of time, and it was so fun for me. It was definitely a commitment, and now that I'm getting more and more of the hang of it, it's becoming more a part of just my daily rhythm. And I think that's what practicing this has become for me, which I'm really excited for because it'll be easier to add this and other things in animal care and growing our homestead if canning has become more of a rhythm for me. Next week, we will be harvesting our corn, planting our garlic, and we will be getting our fall on, and I can't wait to see you there.